Today I'm going to revisit some of the slides from the last two classes. This is a slide that was in your notes from a week ago when we were reading Gonzalez on race and ethnicity. We were talking about here the clinal variation among the human species, that human skin colors vary gradually according to geography all along a range. And that one of the things that happens is that under colonialism, people from certain places are taken to other places and put together with people from far away lands. And so they started to think about these combinations in ways that may not have been the same if you were simply walking or riding a horse between these areas. Now, again, this is not to say that people were never thinking about physical and biological differences. They certainly were, and they would comment on it, and they'd touch each other and look at each other. But the idea that they were grouped together into these blocks of humanity. How many groups, Nick? How many groups were there, did they say?
There were 5 of them.
5 of them, yes. We went through this a little bit back when we were talking about Gonzalez. We talked about Linnaeus. He had, I guess he had 6, but really 2 of them don't count because they were monsters and wild. So we don't count those. So Linnaeus, he had 4. And then Blumenbach is the person who gave us the Caucasian thing. We read about that. I guess we talked a little bit about this in that class. And I even sang that song to you about Jesus loves the little children, which was still taught to me in Sunday school in the 1970s. So it stuck around for a long time. There they are, the 5 groups. Oh no, I only had 4 groups in my Sunday school. We got rid of one of the colors, but there, yeah, we went back to pure Linnaeus on that one. So Blumenbach is the one who gives us these 5 groups, and the Caucasian thing because of the beautiful skull that he thought came from the current country of Georgia and the Caucasus. And that was where maybe the Garden of Eden was, or I mentioned that some people thought that was where Noah's Ark was going to be found. I think some people are still looking around there for Noah's Ark. Yeah, they'll find it pretty soon, I'm sure. So there was the idea that there were these groups of people. And, so they developed these classification systems. And in fact, Taylor, you notice later on, one of our anthropologists talks about a predisposition to classify. What does that mean? Yeah, many humans, I think, like to put things into boxes and classify things. Some people think it is a natural part of humanity to sort of sort things out, trees and frogs, and sort them into categories. And so some people have talked about a human predisposition to classify. And it is true, as we go across different cultural groups, that people try to look at the world and put it into groups or categories. I don't know if all people, they certainly don't all do it in the same way. I'm not sure if all people do it, but there's in some ways a difference between just classifying groups and putting them into a hierarchy, which is what we talked about in the last class. And we've been talking about that people didn't just they weren't simply just interested in describing differences, that you have red and yellow, black, brown, and white, and put all the groups in, or if you have 45 groups or 3 groups or 12 groups, there were all these different ideas about who was in which group. But what really gets us into a problem is not necessarily the classification scheme, but when you put those groups in in a ladder, right? From the least to the best, and you have this idea that there's a stages of humanity. That's where things you get into trouble. I guess I would also, interestingly in this, this has become known as a kind of ascending thing, that we go from the backward to the forward, and that we're on kind of a progressive order. Blumenbach actually was arguing, and others, that there was a devolving, that we were going downhill, right? So that God had created perfection, and then the people were getting worse over time. So both of these ideas, it's kind of the flip side of this, but they both lend themselves to this idea of being able to put people in a hierarchy, not just a classification system. So we get to America, United States, in, I don't know, say the 1870s, 1880s, 1900, around then. What's going on back then, Ashley? What does the United States look like back then? Segregation, yes, it is definitely looking pretty segregated. People are having their own ideas about who goes where. And if you read some of this stuff, Mickey, nice, all right? Just everybody's loving each other back then. Yeah, some pretty vile descriptions of other human beings, especially from people who thought of themselves as superior to others. It's pretty harsh to actually read this stuff, I thought. I don't know if you felt that way, but it's like, it can be very hurtful. I almost felt like people should be warned before they read this, because it's pretty mean. It's pretty vile stuff about what is going on, and how especially the dominant groups are thinking of people who they consider to be less than or other than them. So Juliana, what goes on here? What does our good old buddy Franz Boas do in the middle of all this stuff? Yeah, he was doing the questionnaires. He had the calipers out in his students. He was involved in the measurement. He was actually not someone who was shying away from measurement. He actually was out there doing the questionnaires and the measurements. And we talked about this this is already in your notes, so you don't have to write it down. We talked about this in the last, a week ago, that the first thing that he first believed, that the measurements and the questionnaires and all the science that he would be able to discern, identify, and describe types of humanity. And over those 10 years, he finds out something's different. Pluto, what does he find? They developed different traits that weren't the same as their parents. That the physical category, the physical body, wasn't a stable thing over time, even from one generation to the next. And if the physical body isn't the same, what does that mean about the other stuff? The mental stuff, the cultural stuff. Obviously, if your physical stuff can be changing in one generation, you're not going to really, that's what the societies they make, both human bodies and the societies they make, are plural, fluid, and endlessly adaptable, or plastic here. So the very category of race and the very categorization of these groups, Boas was starting to call this into question. Lauren, what does this mean about how we should look at these other societies, these other groups? no less value than ours. Yeah, but in some ways, then that causes us to call into question these values, or so-called the values of our civilization, or and the values of other cultures and societies. And I want to pause for a second here on the immigration changing our bodies. Brady, what do you think about this? You said you hadn't heard about this.
They talked about an American type child. I thought it was based on immigrants coming from all different places, and then children being made from people from different areas. So they get physical traits from two different places. And that's what an American type child is. There's a lot of like the melting pot.
Yes, yeah, that was the idea, right? The idea was that the immigrants would come in and they'd melt together with some other people that were already here, and then they'd melt out and there'd be a melted kid. But that was the idea. But what Boas proved is they didn't even have to melt with anybody. It was just the physical changes in the next generation based on the new environment in which they were in. What in the world could cause physical form to change in one generation? Huh? Certainly, if you're exposed to contaminants and you grow up in those kinds of conditions, it's probably not going to be a good physical change. I'm thinking, though, about when I look back at pictures of my great-grandparents who didn't have very much to eat when they were living in Italy. And I look at them, actually, I don't have to look at the pictures, I remember them. And I remember my dad being taller than his father and his mother. Like, genetically speaking, right? You're not supposed to be taller than your mom and your dad. But if you didn't have any milk growing up, if you didn't have very good nutrition, you're not going to be very tall. This still happens today. People come in from war-torn areas where they've been malnourished, and in the next generation, all of a sudden, their kids are taller than them. Also, changes in healthcare, how you can, what kind of access you have to that. And a lot of Boas's time, the immigrants who were coming in like my grandparents from places that, they got a lot more nourishment in the United States. So their kids got taller. Today's world, a lot of the immigrants from today's world get unhealthier when they come into the United States, because in the old, where they come from, they were on farms and working, and then they come and eat our stuff and get exposed to those chemicals and eat junk food. So actually, there's a whole study being done on what's called the immigrant health paradox, which is that the health declines when they come to the United States. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is that baby's head shape is actually very malleable. And so some of the changes that Boas was observing was probably because of the different swaddling and cribbing practices that were being used in their new environment. And this is actually happening today. You may have seen some babies around with helmets on. They have to wear these helmets now because we spend so much time on our cribs, on our backs, because that's how you're supposed to sleep, because of the Back to Sleep campaign. But then if you don't give the babies enough tummy time and you're always carrying them around in those car seats and putting them in the car, their heads get flat. Their heads will be flat. And so it's estimated, I can't even believe this, almost 50% of the infants born today are going to be like, kind of have some funny looking heads. And that almost 1 in 4, you can recommend that they wear one of those helmets so they get, their heads get right. which maybe that's, I mean, these guys are probably selling these helmets, so they want you to use them. But this is a serious issue, plagiocephaly, and it's become more common in recent years because we carry our, because the way we care for our young. I'm not trying to make fun of anybody. If you had to wear a helmet, that's good. It's good. It's good that your head shape got right, and if this happens to you, that you're ready, just be aware that it's out there. And the reason I'm dwelling on this is because think about those people with those calipers and measuring heads. Like, if your head form is going to change just based on whether you lie in a crib or not, what are you going to be doing with your racial measurement about the cephalic indexes alone? I'll just say one more thing about this, that a lot of societies and a lot of people don't realize this because they don't talk to enough mothers and enough people in a society that are women. Some societies deliberately kind of do some head molding on their babies' heads to make sure that they have a culturally acceptable head. Again, imagine you're working the calipers and you're like, wait a second, why are all these people, Well, maybe they want it to be that way. By the way, even if you have a flat head, your brain will be fine, but your glasses might be off, so you better wear that helmet. Oh man, I'm sorry. It's just too fun. Hank, there you go. So, did it work? Not the helmet. Did Boas's ideas work? Did they work out there? Liam, did it work? No.
Not really.
No, it was the exact opposite. In fact, that's why I asked you, because you had this quote from Madison Grant, which is 1924. Remember, this study came out from Boas about the changes back in 1910. All these immigrants were coming in. Boas is like, go for it. They're fine. They'll be fine. But no, we passed the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely restricted immigration. Immigration would never, and actually has not ever gotten to be what it once was. And according to Madison Grant, that wonderful person who wrote so many beautiful things in the passing of the great race, we have closed our doors just in time. So in fact, what happened was the opposite of what Boas wanted, which is they passed a lot of laws that were restricting people and basically based on country of origin. Cyrus, did everybody love Boas after he?
It was like, who was posting this like theory after he got all this research done and people were hated. It was like kind of an outsider from the whole like circle. Is all he visiting different, and even sounded too.
Yeah. No, people are hating on him, which is why sometimes I think, that's why I said I go back and forth on that thing that he could have been more radical, because he is getting reviled. He is getting hated on. He is getting basically persecuted as an immigrant and as a Jew at the time. And so basically what is happening in the 1920s is that all these race classifications and restrictions and where people can live and who can marry whom and what you need to sort yourself off into boxes are all on the rise, are on the increase during this time. And so there's Boas fighting for these ideas about, there's not much difference in culture and civilization and relativism. And in general, he is basically losing. He lost on, the anthropologists lost on immigration policy, and they lost on the racial restrictions policy, to the extent that the policies of the United States and the things that the United States were doing in the 1920s got praised and copied by, yes, but, Hitler. Yeah, I didn't want to play the Hitler card, but there he is. Like I said, if you haven't read chapter 6, you may want to read how Adolf Hitler, read the translation of the passing of the great race, wrote letter to Grant, then he writes Mein Kampf, and he says about the United States that it was doing great. And basically the people who designed the policies that were put into place as the Nazis came to power were using the same ideas that were being circulated in the United States, and some of the very same restrictions and ideas about how you should count people and put people in different places. And so the reason all this stuff is crazy important to us is that if you read this stuff, it's the same stuff that we are encountering in today's political rhetoric about who's being replaced in civilization. And if we should let these people, it's the same thing that is underlying our politics today. Boas basically lost. It wasn't until they decided that we would be fighting the Nazis, and it wasn't until basically the civil rights movement of the 1960s that some of these things started to get reduced a little bit again. I put this up there just some of you know, in recent days, there have been these people who lured immigrants from a place in Texas and told them that they were going to get jobs, and then they put them on a plane and landed them in Massachusetts in Martha's Vineyard. Actually, this has a historical precedent from 1962. They were called reverse freedom rides, when people in the South, Black people in the South, were promised jobs and healthcare in the North, and put on a bus and taken to Liam's place, Hyannis, Massachusetts, and just dropped off there. They're like, you deal with them. And, to the credit of the people of Massachusetts, of Hyannis, they banded together, in some ways like the people of Martha's Vineyard, to provide for the people who had been dropped off. But this is a long part of our long history in this country of trying to put people into boxes and move them around, and to use people as immigrants, non-whites, as political ammunition.